In this video, we're going to start chapter 12, which is all about personality. So you've probably taken a personality test at some point in your life. One of the big famous ones, especially lately, is the Myers-Briggs personality test. So they would have you ask sort of these questions around the outside, and it would determine which of these four-letter sections you would fall into based on how you would answer each of these questions. Of course, if you did a full Myers-Briggs test, then you'd answer quite a few more questions than just the four on the screen. But this gives us a good sort of basic understanding of what these different personality types would fall under. Now, if there's one thing that we've learned throughout this course, and I guess other psychology courses, it's that people like to label and categorize things. And especially where psychology is a field where we're trying to explain the thoughts and actions of others, it kind of makes sense that we'd focus in on how our individual differences in thinking and feeling and behaving end up actually affecting or influencing our behavior and our thoughts and therefore our actions. Personality is the subfield of psychology that actually focuses in on these individual differences. So let's start with our usual standard definition here. So personality, we can call this an enduring set of internally based characteristics that create uniqueness and consistency in a person's thoughts and behaviors. So this definition actually has three distinct elements, which I've actually separated back here on the next slide. But we're basically saying that our concept of personality helps us explain some stability in an individual's behavior over time and across different situations, so we get some consistency. People will react differently to the same situation. So if you have two different friends and they're both put in the same situation, they won't both react in the same exact way. There's usually going to be some kind of distinctiveness or uniqueness where each person will have their own approach or own behavior in a given situation. So we've covered the fact that that personality is unique to each individual. It's going to be consistent or durable across times and situations. So those are our first 2 points here. But the next point is that personality helps provide an explanation to account for the expression of behavior. So if we're trying to figure out why someone really enjoys being out and socializing, or maybe why someone doesn't like to go out and socialize, we could point to their personality and specifically a trait of their personality, something like introversion or extroversion, to try and explain why they behave in that particular way when faced with the prospect of interacting and socializing with others. So that gives us our next point here, which is a personality trait. So that's the internally based characteristics that make up our personality. So personality is sort of the big picture. And if we wanted to talk about individual levels or individual sort of qualities one at a time, we could be talking about individual personality traits. And one of the most agreed upon ones is that introversion-extroversion scale, which will come up as we start talking about different kinds of personality explanations and different theories of personality throughout the rest of this chapter. Now, for the psychodynamic perspective, the theorists that we're going to talk about primarily look for the causes of our behavior in terms of a dynamic interplay of inner forces. And they're often going to focus on the fact that there's conflict between these inner forces, and that's what's driving our behavior. And so whenever you hear psychodynamic, at this point in your psychology careers, you should automatically think Freud, because Freud was the pioneer of the psychodynamic perspective. So Sigmund Freud proposed the first and most influential psychodynamic theory called the psychoanalytic theory. And I want to preface this with sort of a disclaimer that while we talk a lot about Freud, and most of this video is going to be about Freud, Freud is one of those cases where his theories were very extreme and weird. And we talk about them now not because we think that they're 100% accurate, but because they served to get other people thinking and talking and theorizing in the field. So they were very influential and led to a lot of modern thinking about personality. So take all of the stuff about Freud with a little bit of a grain of salt, because, as I said, it's a little bit weird. Now, this whole psychoanalytic theory came about because Freud went to study with a French neurologist named Jean Charcot. Charcot. I can never pronounce that one right. And Charcot was researching conversion hysteria, which is a strange situation where physical symptoms, things like blindness or paralysis, would appear suddenly and have no apparent physical cause. So the idea was that this was happening because of some kind of unconscious aspect of the mind. So Freud was convinced that this conversion hysteria was being driven by painful, repressed memories. Freud assumed that these repressed memories were often sexual or aggressive in nature, and by allowing these patients to re-experience those traumatic memories or express those inappropriate feelings, their symptoms would start to improve. Despite criticism, Freud continued to build up this psychoanalytic theory using techniques like hypnosis, free association, and even dream analysis in his attempt to access the unconscious mind. And this theory grew to become a theory of personality, a means for studying the mind and even treating psychological disorders. So let's talk about the specifics of this psychoanalytic theory. Freud seems to have been influenced by hydraulic models of physics that were common at the time when he was coming up with this theory. And those hydraulic models were based around the idea of exchanges and releases of energy. So Freud considered personality to be an energy system. Freud stated that our instinctual drives would create something called psychic energy, and this psychic energy would power the mind and push us for either direct or indirect release. So if we had a buildup of sexual energy, it could be directly discharged as sexual activity or indirectly discharged as sexual fantasies, or something like painting. Lots of diverse outputs for the indirect release. Freud also drew a distinction between three different categories of mental events. We have our conscious, the things that we're actively aware of. So maybe you can be actively aware of the fact that I'm speaking, that you're listening to what I'm saying. Our preconscious is something that you're unaware of at the moment, but could be easily recalled. So if I asked you to think about what you had for dinner yesterday, or if I asked you what you did for your 16th birthday, you might be able to recall those pieces of information from your preconscious and bring them into your conscious awareness. And the last part is our unconscious. And this is the stuff that we're not aware of. Our wishes, impulses, and drives, all the stuff that Freud focused very heavily on. Now we see the conscious and the preconscious fairly often, so we might assume that they make up a large portion of our mind. But Freud would argue that the unconscious is the bulk of our mind, and specifically the most important part of our mind. And we can only see that hidden part when those impulses he talked about are discharged in some sort of way. So we could see the unconscious in our dreams, in a slip of the tongue, and other kinds of disguised behavior. Now this figure shows us a fairly well-known imagination of Freud's theory here, where the conscious is the section of an iceberg that sticks out of the water. It's the small portion that's visible. whereas the preconscious and unconscious are the bulk of the iceberg that's hidden below the surface. Now, this image is also going to include what we're going to talk about next, which are three separate but interacting structures that Freud described to divide up our personality, talking about our id, our ego, and our superego, and all the roles that they took for personality. We're going to start at the bottom here with the id. And the id exists totally within the unconscious mind. It's the innermost core of the personality, and it would be the only structure that Freud thought was present at birth. So this is going to be the source of all of our psychic energy that drives this psychoanalytic theory. So the id has no direct contact with reality and would then function in a totally irrational manner. It's all contained within our unconscious, and this is what's driving all of those urges and impulses that Freud likes to talk about so much. So Freud said that the id would operate according to what he called the pleasure principle. And this principle says that you would seek immediate gratification or release. You would want to act immediately on those urges, on those desires that you have unconsciously. And this drive to act would happen regardless of rational considerations and environmental realities, because the id is separate from our environment and it doesn't have any rational rules governing it. So according to this pleasure principle, if you want something, you just take it, which might explain some of the behavior that you see in young children, where if they want something, they reach out and they take it. There's no impulse control. And that was sort of what helped drive the start of the id being the only structure present when we're young. But if the id has no contact with the outer world, it can't directly satisfy itself by obtaining what it needs from that environment. So over the course of development, new structures start developing to allow that interaction to happen. And the next of these structures to develop would be the ego. So the ego functions primarily at a conscious level. So if we scroll back to our image here, the ego is covering the conscious. But it's also going to bridge that gap between the unconscious and the conscious. So it's going to function mainly to keep the impulses of the id under control. So our ego is going to try and delay gratification. It's going to watch our environment and see when it's safe to act on those impulses. So the ego gives us some form of self-control. And it's going to operate according to a reality principle. So it's going to test our reality, our environment, to decide when and under what conditions the id can safely discharge that psychic energy, those impulses it has, in order to satisfy its needs. So if you're having a buildup of sexual energy, maybe it's going to find a hobby that allows you to discharge that tension. Or maybe you're going to go find your partner. Some way of discharging those urges and impulses in a way that fits with your current environment. The last of the structures to develop is the superego. And this is going to be where our morality comes from. The superego is thought to control the impulses of the id, at least at first, with external control. So from feedback from your environment, you know what is right and what is wrong. And so Freud thought that our superego would develop by the age of 4 or 5, and up to that point, we would start building up these ideas, these values from society. So as a child, you observe your parents and how they're acting, and you can be taught directly what is right and what is wrong. And so from your external environment, you are rewarded for doing good things, things that are right, and you are punished for doing things that are wrong. And as your superego develops, you develop your own form of self-control. So it doesn't have to just be external control from reward and punishment. You could actually start controlling yourself through the superego. And so where the ego would try and delay gratification until it's safe to act on those impulses, the superego tries to permanently block gratification, exerting sort of total self-control. So these moralistic goals that you develop can actually start taking precedence over realistic ones, regardless of the cost. So you can internalize this idea of morality, of what is right and what is wrong, and sometimes that ends up removed from the reality of the situation. The textbook uses the example of maybe if you were raised in a really religious family, you were raised with the idea that sex is wrong. And some people, even when they get married, still have that internalized idea that sex is wrong. And even sex within a marriage starts to feel wrong because of that internalized moral. So that would be a case where the superego has taken precedence over the realistic situation where within marriage, sex should no longer be considered wrong. But sometimes there's a cost associated there, and those internalized morals can take over. So with all that groundwork set, how does this start relating to personality? So Freud said that personality is going to be made up of a dynamic struggle between our id trying to discharge those instinctive energies, our psychic energies, and the opposing forces that are generated by our ego and superego trying to either reroute those energies or completely control those energies. And sometimes our ego can't always control the id, leading to conflict. And so we can have anxiety when the impulses of the id threaten to get out of control. So that anxiety acts kind of like a signal, the way that physical pain would, to warn us of danger, motivate us or motivate our ego to start dealing with the problem of our out of control id. And we can reduce that anxiety through some realistic coping behaviors. So maybe if you have a buildup of anger, maybe you could sit down and have a discussion to dissipate that anger through a realistic coping mechanism of talking about it. Or the ego might resort to defense mechanisms. So if those realistic coping behaviors aren't helping or aren't being used, defense mechanisms can come into place. And defense mechanisms are considered a weapon of the ego. And they're basically distortions of reality. So instead of a healthy coping mechanism, it's going to be a skewing of your own perception. And they often operate unconsciously and can lead to maladaptive behavior. So things like repression, denial, displacement, projection, and so on are all types of defense mechanisms. And they're not necessarily a healthy way to deal with that buildup of psychic energy, though they do, in the short term at least, help alleviate anxiety. Though it can lead to longer term problems because you're not actually getting rid of the anxiety, you're just putting it elsewhere. Now, if that part of Freud's theory wasn't weird enough, we're going to start talking about another aspect called psychosexual development. And so Freud was convinced that a lot of our personality was molded by early life experiences. So he dealt a lot with people's childhood and things that they dealt with during their childhood. So Freud proposed that children pass through a series of psychosexual stages during which the id's pleasure-seeking tendencies would be focused on specific pleasure-sensitive areas of the body, called erogenous zones. Now, if we hop to the next slide, we can take a look at these different stages that he pointed out. Stages including our oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital stages, where the erogenous zones correspond to the stages, and we progress through them from the age, from birth all the way up to puberty. And so each of these stages has a key task that's associated with the particular erogenous zone. So during the oral stage right after birth, so from the age of 0 to 2, your erogenous zone focused on the mouth, and the key task is weaning, so breastfeeding and then stopping breastfeeding. And I did warn you that this was a weird one. But Freud said that our adult personality would be a function of our progress through these different stages. And if we had inadequate or excessive gratification at any of those stages, it could lead to fixation. So we would have arrested development where our interests would focus on a particular area. And because these are all erogenous zones, areas that we shouldn't, according to society, be focusing on, it could lead to problems in terms of our personality. For obvious reasons, Freud's psychoanalytic theory was very controversial, even when it first came out. Most theorists rejected the idea of childhood sexuality. There is some agreement that childhood experiences like emotional attachments can influence our personal development and our personality development, but there isn't a whole lot of support for Freud's specific stages. So why do we talk about this? And it's because this got the field started. It got people talking about personality and what might be driving our personality. While he was trying to gather evidence for his theory, Freud was pretty set against the idea of experimental research. He thought that a lot of these complex phenomena couldn't really be observed under controlled conditions because you would lose some of that complexity. And that's kind of supported by people who look at the psychodynamic perspective today, but mostly because it's actually difficult to study these kinds of situations in the lab. It's a lot easier to use a clinical setting or an observational setting where you can witness the effects of different aspects of personality. It's very hard to manipulate and control personality. So if we want to critically evaluate the psychoanalytic theory, we can come up with quite a few shortcomings. In addition to the bizarreness of some of the statements, it's actually very difficult to test a lot of the aspects of this theory. It's hard to tell if you're seeing genuine results or if it's the result of some kind of defense mechanism. A lot of these concepts are really ambiguous and really hard to evaluate. For example, how would you operationally define and measure something like id impulses? It's pretty hard. So even though today there is still some research that falls within this psychodynamic theory, there's not a whole lot left. We still see things like free association, discussion of defense mechanisms, and even repression still being studied today, but a lot of the specifics related to Freud and his theories, not so much. I guess the closest we come is the idea of unconscious processes still having a very strong component of our personality. We do see some evidence for that, especially in terms of, say, the cognitive perspective. We have ways of measuring what's going on in the brain. We can see brain activity as we do different actions. And there is evidence that there's a lot of unconscious or non-conscious processes. A lot of our brain sort of runs itself. Things like breathing and digesting, those things happen in the background. And we can even have things that we are registering in our brain, but we aren't consciously aware of. Things like subliminal messages or even non-relevant information that we filter out by not paying attention to it. So the idea of our unconscious having an effect on our personality isn't completely far-fetched. As I've mentioned about Freud, a lot of his ideas, as strange and far-fetched as some of the theories may seem to be, they had a beneficial outcome because they led to a lot of growth and discussion within a lot of the areas that he was researching. So next we're going to look at some of our Neo-Freudian perspectives, basically meaning the perspectives that stemmed from and followed Freud's psychoanalytic perspective. So each of these is going to focus in on something that they thought that Freud's ideas lacked, and how they wanted to fix it. So we're going to specifically look at Jung, Adler, and Horney, three different perspectives that started with Freud's ideas and kind of took them and ran with them. So first, Jung focused in on the analytical perspective. So he was a Swiss physician. He was one of Freud's earliest supporters, so he very much started off believing with what Freud was doing. He really focused in on the unconscious, but eventually they started to disagree on some of the specifics, again, that were going on. So Jung really disliked Freud's ideas about the nature of the unconscious mind. Jung's perspective on the unconscious was what we would call the collective unconscious. So this idea that our unconscious mind includes not only our own experiences, but the experiences of past generations and different people throughout the world. He pointed to sort of different universal knowledges, things that were shared among different cultures, tendencies that people all have. So things that they enjoy, things that they dislike, that we'd see again across multiple places in the world, as well as another term that he was really focused in on, and these are archetypes. So archetypes would be universal thought patterns and behavior rituals that would be triggered or brought about by different situations, symbols, images, whatever. So these archetypes would basically be like roles that individuals could take on. So you could be the rebel or the sage, the hero, the trickster. He had a whole list of these archetypes, and he argued that everyone would fit into one of these categories. And differences between individuals, differences in personality, came from how they interpreted or took on these different roles. Our next Neo-Freudian perspective is Adler's individual perspective. So Adler was another early supporter of Freud, and again disagreed with him eventually, and specifically on the idea that there was an unconscious sexual need, that there were sort of the meaning or deeper meaning into dreams, and they also disagreed on the role of the ego. So according to Adler, our primary source of motivation for our personality was actually our sort of striving for superiority, a motivational source for us trying to overcome imagined feelings of personal inferiority to try and reach our full potential. And this idea of potential is something that we're going to talk about again when we get into some of our humanistic theories. But this striving for superiority, rather than being an unconscious driving force, as a lot of Freud's ideas focused in on, this was something that operated at a conscious level. So it was something that you were aware of. So we were actively trying to be better people. And we would strive for superiority, and we would be guided using a principle called the principle of social interest. So this is when we would be considering the needs of others and trying to better society in order to achieve our own full potential. So we would be striving to make society better. We would strive to help others in order to become better ourselves. And from this framework, Adler would say that the uniqueness of the individual would be based on which strategies we chose when we're trying to strive for this superiority. So we would see consistency of our behavior based on which strategies we're using and which goals we're specifically pursuing at a particular time. Our next perspective is to look at Horney. So Karen Horney was a German psychoanalyst, again, trained with Freud, and started supporting Freud, but eventually branched off. So Horney focused on interpersonal relationships, rather than Freud's idea of looking for conflict internally. So she was looking at how we interacted with others and how that would affect our personality. So, according to Horney, the motivational force for our personality was a search for social security. And social security is just when we feel safe and loved within our relationships with others. So, we would be pushed to seek out social security. We would want to feel safe, we would want to feel loved and welcomed in our relationships. And if we weren't feeling safe and loved, if we were feeling powerless, unsafe, and unloved, we would start feeling what she termed basic anxiety. So we would start feeling anxious, and then we would seek out ways to combat that anxiety. And we're going to see a couple of strategies for that on the next slide as well. And then while we were having this anxiety, we would also be feeling some anger and hostility during these periods of insecurity. And we could call that basic hostility because it's caused by basic anxiety. And so this chart here does a nice job summarizing. So as we're trying to appease our social anxiety, we're seeking out social security. We're seeking out love and acceptance. And we could do this by moving toward people, moving against people, or moving away from people. So if we move toward people, we would be cooperating with others to obtain affection and protection from them. If we move against people, we could be aggressive to obtain power over others. And if we're moving away from people, we might have sort of social and emotional withdrawal from others. So maybe by pulling away from others, we would prevent ourselves from being harmed. And in the same way that we were looking at some of the pros and cons of the original Freudian perspective, we can also critically evaluate our Neo-Freudian perspectives. On the positive side of things, Jung's expanded emphasis on the influence of the unconscious mind was useful. This was something that we talked about at the start with Freud and pushing for the importance of the unconscious mind beyond things that we're actively thinking of, but having it continued was a good thing. We had some ideas that came from both Adler and Horney, and they expanded the emphasis on the importance of social relationships and how those would affect our expression of personality. So prior to this, it was mostly Freud and those internal focuses. But by being pushed by these two researchers to focus on our social interactions, that was a good thing as well. Sort of led us to the future different perspectives that we're going to talk about later on. For limitations, we've probably figured out that a lot of these perspectives are fairly vague in terms of concepts, and they didn't really yield something that could be concretely or objectively measured. And in fact, many of these researchers didn't come up with their own research concepts. We just found support or ideas that worked with them as time has gone on, but they didn't really develop a lot of primary research that showed support for their own work. And again, of course, because we're in relationship with Freud, a lot of these perspectives are based on very biased samples of clinical observations. So they chose data that sort of matched their ideas. So it wasn't as objectively scientific as some of the other concepts we're going to look at.